Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Rachel, and I am one of the co-chairs of the last lecture committee for Mortar Board. Like I said, thank you all so much for being here. I know that this time of the semester is pretty hectic, so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And I really hope you all got some yummy dessert out in the room out there. I don't know what to call it, a foyer, but you all know what I'm talking about. So tonight we will have our guests present for about an hour, and then we will have some time for Q&A at the end. We will also be able to take questions throughout the lecture for Dr. Galvan. So if you are on Zoom joining us virtually, please put your questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to those. But if you are in the space in person, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to be over here looking for people, and I will make sure that Dr. Galvan can see you. But as we gather here today for this last lecture series with Dr. Galvan, let's take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place. And in doing so, recognize that the land which the University of San Diego occupies is part of the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. We pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. It is important to learn about the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on this land. I am so excited and honored to introduce our speaker tonight and to also give you a little bit of background on Mortar Board and what we do. So to first give you an overview of Mortar Board, in case you aren't familiar, I know we have some Mortar Board members here representing tonight, but Mortar Board is a national honor society that recognizes college seniors for distinguished achievement in scholarship, leadership, and service. Mortar Board began in 1918 as the first national organization honoring senior college women. It was open to men in 1975, retaining as part of its purpose to promote and advance the status of women. Mortar Board members have a lifetime commitment to the ideals of Mortar Board, scholarship, leadership, and service. The USD Mortar Board chapter, the Judy Lewis Logue Alcala chapter, was formed in October 2000 and renamed in October 2020 in honor of its founder, Judith Lewis Logue. The National Mortar Board Leadership awarded our chapter the Ruth Weimer Mount Award for Chapter Excellence this past year, 2021, and in 2006 for the best Mortar Board chapter in the country. Each year between those two, our chapter has also been recognized as one of the top chapters across the nation. Mortar Board began hosting the last lecture series, which you are all here joining us today, at USD in fall of 2010. The series is inspired by Dr. Randy Pouches, excuse me for not saying that name correctly, but inspired by his last lecture at Carnegie Mellon on the topic of achieving your childhood dreams. Dr. Pouch delivered this lecture while terminally ill. Thankfully, our speaker is here and healthy, but the goal of our last lecture series is to provide an opportunity for a distinguished faculty member to consider what they would say if giving a lecture as if it was their last. I'm almost done talking, I promise. But most importantly, I want to introduce you all to our wonderful guest that we have tonight, Dr. Veronica Galvan from the Psychological Sciences Department. Some of you may know her really well, but Dr. Galvan earned her PhD in neurobiology and behavior. Her graduate work focused on how neurons in the brain change the activity during learning and memory. At USD since 2003, Dr. Galvan teaches a variety of courses that focus on brain and cognition, including human memory, biological psychology, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience of sleep. She is honored to have been recognized for excellence in teaching with the Davies Award for Teaching Excellence, as well as recognition from Mortar Board and several other student organizations. Dr. Galvan was also recently inducted as an honorary member of our chapter of Mortar Board here at USD. Her current research interests center on technology and cognition. Dr. Galvan actively works with undergraduates. Her undergraduate research students have presented their work at regional and national conferences, winning poster awards for their presentations. Dr. Galvan has also received public interest in her work and has been interviewed by the New York Times, BBC, The Guardian, The Guardian, and German Public Radio. Dr. Galvan is an active member of the American Academy of Science Pacific Division as head of the psychology section. Her peers recently selected her to serve as a member of the Academy's Executive Council. Dr. Galvan is also a regular speaker at public events, including USD's Grandparents Weekend, and gladly shares sheep brain demonstrations with middle and high school students, as well as military associated personnel. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Veronica Galvan with a big round of applause.
Rachel, thank you so much for that introduction. It's much appreciated. When I was invited to speak, I was very excited. It's like, what topic am I going to talk about for the last time that I have a captive audience, right? Nobody can run away. So in my classes, we do talk about news articles. We talk about articles that mention brain and behavior and how they might be related to research articles and how they might be related to topics that we're talking about in class. So that led me to this title, Hacking Your Brain, What Science Suggests We Can Do to Improve Our Health and Happiness. And actually, if at any point you can't hear me, let me know. Just give me some sort of signal. Let's see here. Okay, let's see if I can get rid of that. Just one second. Okay, so in the news recently, we've got a lot of negative news stories, but I'm going to go ahead and start with something that's a little bit of a lighter negative news story. So recently there was an article. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to just use the mouse. So that seems to be working. So your night light may be slowly killing you, right? So that's probably not good news. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's not all bad news. So here's some other articles that have been in the news recently. One of them is eating 2 servings a week of a fatty fruit can reduce heart attack risk. So that's good news. And then also, brisk walking may shave 16 years off your biological age, right? And so there are some topics that get a lot of attention in the news, and some of them in particular have a lot of research to back them up. So in particular, thinking of nutrition, exercise, and sleep, there's a fair amount of research to support how important those factors are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrition, a little bit about exercise, a lot about sleep. And then at the very, very end, I'm going to talk a little bit about additional tips to support our health and happiness. All right, so here we go with pillar number 1. So nutrition. Let me see if I can move that a little bit. All right. And so here, a lot of us might be familiar with the Mediterranean diet. Whoops. And so let me back up a little bit. So that would include eating fatty fish, olive oil, nuts, fruits, berries, vegetables, whole grains. That also includes anti-inflammatory foods. So the idea here is to eat the rainbow, right? So eat different fruits and vegetables that are different colors of the rainbow. And so I'm going to pause for a little bit and talk about inflammation. So there's 2 main kinds of inflammation. One is acute inflammation. So we run into something, we've got localized swelling. And so this is our body trying to heal and repair that area. But we also can have chronic inflammation. So if we have inflammation that is long-term, this actually could cause damage to healthy cells, healthy tissues, and healthy organs. So inflammation, not good. But one thing we can do is eat the rainbow and then tamp down on that inflammation a little bit. And so we've got one more point here. And I think this is actually really interesting, this idea here that timing is important. And so the research suggests that we do want to eat breakfast. We don't want to skip it. And if possible, we want to eat breakfast by 8:30 in the morning. But it's also good to have a period of time where we're not eating. So if possible, about 12 hours of time where we're not consuming food. So if possible, we would stop eating dinner by 7:30 p.m., eat breakfast 7:30 a.m. in the morning. And the idea is that this 12 hours of not eating, it gives our body a little bit of a break. So this helps tamp down inflammation, helps regulate blood sugar, and helps with metabolism, right? All right, so this is pillar number 1. We're going to go on now to pillar number 2, exercise, very important. So if we do exercise regularly, we would reduce stress hormones, elevate mood. So probably not a lot of surprises here. We would also promote neuronal survival, which in turn would enhance learning and memory. And some good news is it doesn't need to be too long. So for basically about 30 minutes a day, 5 times a week. But there's also some recent research that I think is really interesting. And the idea here is that, and I know it's going to be a little bit hard to see, that the impact is bigger if we actually exercise with other people, right? So if there's a social component to our exercise, there's a bigger boost than if we exercise by ourselves. I'm not really sure why I included this picture. There's a bunch of my roller skating friends and me. So roller skating is exercise, and there's a social component, right? I don't think there's any additional benefit for wearing Halloween costumes, but I'm going to go ahead and say that it does give you something to talk about as you're skating around in circles. So there's that. And so now that we've finished 2 of the pillars, we're going to go on to the 3rd one. And so this is sleep. And I'm a little bit biased, but I would say out of the 3 that this is the most important one. And so we have sleep researchers, and they would make the point that we could go 24 hours without exercise and we'd be fine. 24 hours without food, we wouldn't be very happy, but we'd be okay. But 24 hours without sleep, we would be fairly devastated. We're going to have a host of problems if that's the case, right? And so even though it's important, it's still very much a mystery. And so we have the idea here that it occupies almost a third of our lives. So we're fortunate we make it to our 90s, but that also means that we will have spent about 30 years sleeping, right? That's such a long time. And obviously it must be important if we're going to spend that much time sleeping. And yet, go ahead and have this here, we're still learning the basics of why we sleep, why it's important, what happens if we don't sleep, right? So that takes us to my next section. And so some of the things that we'll chat about are what are some of the characteristics of sleep? What are the mechanisms of sleep? Why is sleep important? And then also to end, tips for better sleep. All right, so here we go, some characteristics of sleep. And this might be familiar to a lot of people, but it's always good to have everybody on the same page. So there's 2 main types of sleep. One type is non-REM, so non-rapid eye movement. In non-REM sleep, there's actually 4 stages. So we've got stages 1 through 4. And as we go through those stages, our brain waves are going to slow in frequency. They're also going to have a larger amplitude as we drift into deeper sleep. Okay, so that's non-REM. We're going to contrast that with REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement. So literally, we've got the eyes rolling back and forth. In rapid eye movement, we can look at the EEG. And so we could have a person hooked up to electrodes, look at their brainwave activity and see what's happening. Sometimes people call REM sleep paradoxical sleep because the EEG, if you kind of squint a little bit, it looks similar to the brain activity while we're awake, right? So that's interesting. But in REM sleep, we have low voluntary muscle tone. And so we're not able to move our arms and legs in REM sleep. And that's a good thing because we've got potentially bizarre dreams going on and all that kind of good stuff. So next I have here some different EEG patterns. So here we've got waking. So we've got small, high frequency EEG. Stage 1, the person is starting to fall asleep. So the EEG is going to have a slower frequency, so less cycles per second. Stage 2 is slightly deeper. Every once in a while, we get a different sleep component showing up. Sometimes the researchers bundle stage 3 and 4 together. And so here we've got a deeper sleep overall. You can see we've got these nice large rolling delta waves, large amplitude, and even more so in stage 4 sleep. And I'm sorry about this, for REM sleep, it's going to be a little bit hard to see. But again, this is paradoxical sleep. The EEG is going to be a little bit faster, a little bit smaller, and again, sort of kind of looks like a waking, but not really, but it's kind of close. And so these different brain waves, they appear in a particular pattern. And so we move from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and then we're going to reverse it, back it up, go then stage 3, 2, and then REM. And so each one of these cycles is going to last about 90 minutes. And if we're fortunate, right, we're getting our good 7 to 8 hours of sleep, we would have 4 or 5 of these cycles by the time morning rolls around. But it's not exactly the same pattern every time we go through the cycle, right? So the idea here is that we, with more time, so as the night progresses, we're going to spend more time in REM sleep. And we're going to see that here on the next figure. So here we have a typical night of sleep in a young adult. So we're starting with stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, REM. We skip stage 1 because we've already fallen asleep. And then that pattern is going to repeat throughout the night, but again, not identical. We're losing stage 3, 4 as we get closer to morning, and we are having longer periods of REM sleep. So sometimes students will ask, you know, does it matter if I go to bed later? Or does it matter if I wake up earlier? And the answer is yes, right? Because earlier in the night, we're going to get more non-REM sleep. And then as we get closer to the morning, we'll get REM sleep. And so there is some interesting research that each type of sleep, non-REM versus REM, makes different contributions. So we really actually don't want to lose either one if possible. All right. And so now that we've talked about the characteristics, we can talk about some of the mechanisms. And so there are 2 processes that influence sleep. One of them is called process S. And so we have a chemical called adenosine, and it builds up in our brain the longer that we are awake. So if somebody has had a full day, they've been awake a long time, they've got a lot of adenosine. And so that will accumulate and create sleep pressure. So there's going to be a strong drive to sleep the longer that we've been awake. There is a drug that we have all heard of. It's caffeine. Oh shoot. I don't know if I can do this with the microphone, but the idea is that caffeine will bind to the receptor and it will compete with adenosine, right? So if we're drinking caffeine, we're not allowing adenosine to bind, and so we'll feel less sleepy. All right, and so here's a figure from recent research. And this is tough, right? We've got a person who has stayed awake for 52 hours, which is a very long time. But what we can see is, well, that the adenosine has built up over that time period. So really high levels of adenosine, so much so that this person is actually getting new adenosine receptors in response to this big influx of adenosine, right? Okay, so this is process S, again, one of 2. The other process is process C. So we've got this daily cycle of alertness and sleepiness. And so it's the circadian rhythm. And some people might know circadian comes from circa dia. So about 24 hours, we're going to have a repeat of our daily cycles, right? So process C. Something that's kind of interesting about process C is that we have an internal clock, right? So we've got a brain area that will help us restart the day every 24 hours, okay? And so this brain area is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. There it is. The SCN is going to set our diurnal rhythms. And so the idea is we're exposed to sunlight. We've got cells in the back of our eye. They're going to send the signal here to the SCN and tell us, oh, it's daylight. We should be awake, right? And so here I've got that same information in a bullet point. It's going to receive information from those retinal cells so we can get the day started every day. Something that you guys are likely familiar with, you've probably heard that at night we should not be looking at, computers, TV screens, phones, iPads, things like that. They're going to emit blue light. That signal is going to go to the SCN and say, hey, it's still daylight. You should not be going to sleep, right? So if possible, we want to minimize our screen exposure at night, right? Because that's going to stimulate process C. All right. So here we've got a figure of the two processes working together. I think process S is a little easier to understand. So again, this is where the adenosine accumulates the longer that we've been awake. Process C, which was the circadian rhythms, we've got periods of alertness and time when we're less alert. So there's going to be a point in the day where we've got a lot of adenosine and we're not getting an alerting signal. So we are going to feel tired, right? And so we're going to mention both of those processes a little bit later. So for now, I'll mention a little bit about why sleep is important. And so I like this slide. I have to get a shout out to my partner who made this. So it's a few functions of sleep. So this is not an exhaustive list. And I'm hoping when you see this, you realize like, oh my goodness, that's such a wide variety of functions that's associated with sleep. So we've got memory and cognition, something called the glymphatic system, emotional health, glucose metabolism, and immunity. So we're going to take a look at each one of those briefly on the next slide. All right. And I'm going to echo what Rachel said earlier. If you have any questions, comments, let me know. But in the meantime, I'll keep going. And so here for memory and cognition, if somebody is able to get decent sleep, that's actually going to improve learning and memory. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. It's actually going to improve decision-making and creativity. And so in addition to memory and cognition, we also have emotional health. So getting a decent night of sleep will help us recalibrate our emotional circuits and normalize stress hormones. So if we've had a day where something negative has happened during the day, getting a decent night of sleep will actually take some edge off of that negativity and we will perceive it differently the next day, right? All right, so that's emotional health. And we also have this idea here of immunity, right? So when we're sleeping, we've got a boost in immune function. And so this would help us fight malignancy, prevent infection, and reduce chronic inflammation. We already had mentioned, well, chronic inflammation, not a good thing. We'll also add here, and I think this is also really interesting as well. With a decent night of sleep, this will help us balance insulin and glucose, helps us regulate appetite and healthy food selection. So there's been a fair amount of research with just a single night of sleep deprivation that puts us in a pre-diabetic state. We're no longer responding to insulin and sugar in our blood in a typical way, right? Just with one single night. There's been other research where people who are sleep deprived, what are they going to do? No surprises, they're going to eat more the next day. So that might be bad enough. But when people are given access to basically a buffet, right? All you could eat, healthy food, junk food, people who've been sleep deprived, they're going to just go, whole hog on the junk food, right? So again, with sleep deprivation, it's actually going to change the food choices that we make, right? Okay. So the last one I have here is a glymphatic system. And so here we've got the idea that it promotes clearance of toxic protein fragments, including amyloid and metabolites. And so with the glymphatic system, it's actually really interesting that our glial cells, it's a different kind of brain cell, they're going to shrink at night. And so literally that leaves more space in between cells. And so toxic substances can be flushed out of our system. right? So again, we go to sleep, we get now an opportunity to get rid of some of these toxins. For people who are sleep deprived, they're going to lose that opportunity, and they're actually going to be at increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, right? Oh yeah, go for it, Monique. What do we got? Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Yes, I will. Yes, thank you, Perla. And so we were just talking about that today in class, talking about night shifts, and it's easy for me to say because I come from basically a position of privilege where I never had to work the night shift, right? But people who do work the night shift, they often have shorter lifespans, right? They don't often live as long because even though they might do their best and do the blackout curtains and do sunglasses when they're driving home, their SCN, right, is still going to be sensitive to light because we're not driving home in the dark. We got to see where we're driving. And so their body is still expecting to be on a different rhythm, right? So this is actually not good for our health. And there's been similar studies for people who experience like a lot of jet lag and things like that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So it's a good question. So how might this impact people who are military associated personnel? It is going to be something similar, right? So any kind of disturbances might increase sleep fragmentation. And so that's not necessarily going to be a good thing. There could be compensatory sleep like the next night and things like that. But it's a stressor on our body, right? To try to change and adapt to these different shifts, depending on even where the shifts come from. And so if possible, if we can have the choice, we will try to minimize it. I do have a section on the end, tips that may help, but that's a tough one. Yeah, good. Thank you. I appreciate it for both of you guys. Okay, good. All right, so here are a few functions of sleep. I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit more about sleep and memory. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. And so we have the idea we learn something during the day, we experience something new during the day. We've got a activity, a pattern of brain activity that's happening when we're learning something new. And so what research has shown is that whatever pattern of activity we had during the day, we can see that same pattern of activity in the person's brain when they're sleeping, right? So here we've got this reinstatement, this reactivation, right, when we're sleeping. And so you might ask, okay, why is this person replaying what happened during the day? What's the benefit of that? And so the idea is that this allows for adaptation of intracellular connections. So what does that mean in English? The idea is that when we sleep, this could enhance our learning and memory, right? Okay. And so that brings me here to this next part, that there's a correlation between brain activity. Now we're talking about when we're sleeping. So a correlation between brain activity during non-REM and an overnight gain in performance. So what this is saying is if we get a decent night of sleep, the next day we're going to have better memory, right? And that honestly is so amazing. And I would love to talk about just that the whole time, because people don't need to put in extra effort. They don't need to study longer, but if they sleep, they're going to do, studies suggest a minimum of 20% better, if not more. So just by sleeping, right? So I like, just a second. I like to tell my students that sleeping, you could consider that like a study tool, right? And it's almost like magic because people are going to do better the next day, even though they're not spending more effort doing it. Sorry, go ahead. Yes. So definitely for sure. And that's one of my favorite topics. So the idea here of spaced learning versus mass practice, otherwise known as cramming, right? Which, I used to do also. But if we study across different days, that gives us more opportunity, right, to solidify and consolidate that information. Yes. So there's a lot of interesting research on that whole topic. So I totally agree. Good. Okay, good. All right. So again, like magic, but not really. We'll do better the next day just by sleeping. And so now we can talk a little bit about loss of sleep. And honestly, most of this is the flip side of stuff that we already had talked about. But if there is somebody who is chronically sleep deprived, and it's a long list, right? So if somebody is chronically sleep deprived, they would have decreased immune system function, increased risk of cancer, increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, heart problems, strokes, psychiatric illnesses. No surprise here. Impaired cognitive functions. We talked about this a little bit. Shorter lifespan, right? They won't live as long, and with decreased quality of life. And so probably of interest to a lot of people here, and I'm sorry it's there at the bottom and just part of it is cut off. So for students, there was a research study that suggested that in students, poor sleep could actually predict academic performance or poor academic performance, academic problems. And what the researchers were saying in this study is that sleep is such an important factor that it was as important or maybe even more important than stress, binge drinking, and drug use. And so what they wanted to emphasize in that research paper is they really wish that more administrators were familiar with that, right? If sleep is so important, maybe we should do a better job of sharing that information, letting other people know, right? So we go from loss of sleep, we go to sleep and aging. The picture doesn't get very pretty here either, but we do have that last section on tips to benefit sleep. So here for sleep and aging, we saw this slide earlier. We had a typical night of sleep, and we've got our lovely pattern that repeats. It's not exactly the same, but I do have some questions for you guys. And this is one I ask in class also. So now we've got sleep pattern in the elderly. It's not very pretty, but what is different? What kind of things do you see are different in this pattern? Oh, sorry, can you say it louder? Yeah. Right. Oh, no, sorry. I missed what she said. Anybody? Oh, okay, good. All right. Sorry, I missed that. Okay, good. So we've got REM, kind of REM sleep showing up kind of in different places. Thank you. Okay, what else do we have? Thank you. Yeah. Okay, possibly less time in REM. Good. And there's some other big changes. What else are we missing? Oh, good. Thank you. What we got? Okay, they're waking up a lot. Some right also nodding her head. Good. What else are we missing? Anything else? At least one more. Yeah. Yeah, right. So we're getting a lot less stage 3 and 4 as we get older, right? And so the sleep is fragmented. They're waking up a lot, having to spend more time in lighter sleep, stage 1 and 2, because they're awake and then they need to fall asleep again. So this does not look very good. And so here we have a list. So changes in sleep as we age, right? And so there we have less amount and smaller amplitude of slow wave sleep. So that's stage 3, 4. We lose that. We actually did get our audience to mention that. That was great. An increase in stage shifts, right? We're waking up more.
Change her and do bath.
And 2, some more.
See if she'll nap. You had a bath for him or?
Oh, I don't know what that is. Okay, we've got a ghost in the system. Okay, that's interesting. Hello, we're in Zoom land. Okay, so another change as we age, we've got more time awake in bed following sleep onset. And then for some of us, we've got early morning awakening. So we're awake at 3 or 4 in the morning and then not able to fall back asleep. So not good news here. And the problem is that the need for sleep does not change as we age, right? So people still need quality sleep, but they're not getting it. So the inability to sleep could be due to changes in circadian rhythm. It could be insomnia comorbid with illness. And the idea here is that insomnia is secondary. So maybe the person has chronic pain, maybe they've got like acid reflux. So there's other challenges that are causing the insomnia. It could also be the medication that somebody is taking. So some medication is stimulating. It's not good to take that medication later in the day because it's going to make it harder to sleep. And then we've also got other sleep disorders. So maybe a person has sleep apnea or something like that, and that's going to make it harder to sleep. So we have talked about the functions of sleep and why it's important, what happens when we get it, what happens when we don't get it. And so now our last section here is tips for better sleep. And so here I borrowed, this is my youngest right there, very good sleeper. But now our official list, here it comes. And so the most important one, if at all possible, we need to try to maintain a consistent bedtime and rise time. And so I say that, but this can be kind of hard to do. So one suggestion is to, because I think the rise time is a little bit easier. So if we can set our alarm for 5 minutes earlier every day, we're going to wake up a little bit earlier every day. We're awake longer, increase sleep pressure, and so it's going to make it a little bit easier to go to bed a little bit earlier. The next one is to use the bed only for sleep and satisfying sex. I leave that to you to decide what that means. I'm not really sure. I'm just kidding. Okay, but I do want to say that the idea here is based on classical conditioning, right? Pavlovian conditioning. So we want to kind of train ourselves to associate bed with sleep. So if possible, right, we want to not read so much in bed, not watch TV in bed, not do our homework, all kinds of stuff like that, and literally train ourselves to use the bed for sleep. Right? Okay, so that's the second one. Here we go. Oh, I'm so sorry, Rachel. We got somebody on Zoom. Go for it. Oh, you know what? I do not know, right? So that's a good question. And so definitely there's a developmental period for sleep that they're going to, I'll say, gain new sleep skills as they get a little bit older. And it's partially related to different parts of the brain maturing at different times. I don't know if there's that association, like somebody who's a poor sleeper when they're a baby, is that related to their sleep later on? So that's a good question. All right, thank you. All right, so here for number 3, we've got minimize noise and temperature extremes. We want to not be too distracted or woken up while we're sleeping. Here, if possible, to keep the bedroom as dark as possible. So this goes back to process C. We don't want that signal going to our SCN to tell us it's still daylight or something like that. And so that actually goes back to the news article. Your nightlight may be slowly killing you. I think it depends on how bright the nightlight is, right? And whether it's emitting blue light, but okay, so we'll keep going. Other things to mention, again, if possible, don't lie in bed awake. If you're awake for more than 20 minutes, the idea is to get out of bed, use the dimmest light possible, go do something else until you feel sleepy, and then go back to bed. So again, going to idea with sleep training. Yes, what do we got? I do own a pair of blue light blocking glasses, and supposedly they at least they sent me a little light where you could test it and see that, oh, we actually are eliminating it. And so I don't know the research in that particular area, but I feel like the glasses can't hurt, so I definitely have a pair. So we have that. So that was about blue light glasses. Yes, ma'am. What do we got? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the idea or the question is at night we've got a different kind of light weight that's coming through, and does that have an impact? And so yes, the sun is setting, and so I don't know all the specifics, but I think it's like a different wavelength of light, and that's also could be a signal that we're at the end of the day, so it's almost time to get ready for sleep. Yeah. Well, sorry, we'll go you and then you. What do we have? Okay. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And that was been in the news a lot recently, the use of melatonin. And so I'm going to put in a plug for a book called Why We Sleep by Dr. Walker. So he's a sleep researcher. And so he mentions research that apparently even within like a particular package of melatonin pills, that the amount of melatonin within one package from the same brand actually might be quite variable, right? And then the other thing, and this is the part that was in the news recently, is that we don't really know the long-term effects of melatonin use. So maybe it might be better to use it like in terms of dealing with jet lag and things like that, and maybe not so much for long-term use, especially since the amount could be very variable. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then, yes, ma'am, go ahead. So that's a good question. We had a question about naps, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to show it. Let's see. Okay, you can kind of see it there, right? So avoid naps if possible. I didn't pay her, but that was perfect, right? Thank you. But there's some okayness about it. So we'll catch that in just a second. So avoid naps, especially after 3 p.m. But if there's difficulty falling asleep at night, right? And so this is something I tell my class all the time. So sometimes I'll fall asleep in the car and I'll get so mad at myself. I'm not driving. I should mention that. I'm a passenger, right? Because that would be even worse. And I'll say, oh no, I'm probably going to have trouble sleeping tonight because now I've gotten rid of some of my adenosine. I've lost some of my sleep pressure, right? So that's why I say don't sleep too late. But there are cultures who regularly sleep. So I think that's also part of the difference, right? If this is something that we do often and maybe not too long as we mentioned, it might be fine. I think the irregular naps might be not as beneficial, right, as regular naps. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. And it's a good question. What's the ideal length for a nap? And there is research on it. I'm not completely familiar with it. But I actually have heard that between 20 minutes. I'm going to look, see, okay, we got some help here. I think even 20 to 60, I think is fine. Yeah. But I think partially it's also just when it's taken. Yeah. Okay, good. Good. Oh, yes, Mariah. Okay, so some good questions. Well, let me go to this top one here. So I'm going to catch you in a second, Mariah. So avoid nicotine, heavy meals if possible, right? Because now we got our digestive systems working too hard. Exercise is going to be stimulating, so not good right before bedtime. This one could be kind of hard. Avoid caffeine and alcohol 5 hours before bed, exactly what Mariah said. And so alcohol may make it easier to fall asleep, but it's also going to affect our REM sleep, and it could affect our patterns. And then we also might wake up then in the middle of the night. And so I think it might depend on the sleep researcher you talk to. I'm not a sleep researcher, but I think a lot of them would say that medications don't give natural sleep. It's more a form of sedation, right? And so we wouldn't feel necessarily as well rested when we wake up in the morning. Walker goes on to talk about like how many sleeping pills somebody would take a year, and then how that's correlated with negative benefit. But it's a correlation, so so we're also kind of stuck there. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Most of the drugs people talk about are benzodiazepines and other non-benzodiazepines, so acting on GABA receptors. I don't know so much about the SSRIs, so that one I have to leave it as a question mark. That's a good question. Okay, all right. So here, other things, I'm sorry, guys. So avoid pets in bed at nighttime, just because they're gonna move around and possibly distract us and wake us up. But here's some good news. Relax, hot bath or hot shower before bed. So the cooling off of our body is a signal to our brain like, hey, it's almost time to get ready to go to sleep. And then if possible, to aim for optimum sunlight exposure. And so get sunlight in the day. We're talking about process C. It tells us again, oh, the sun is rising. It's time to start over again. And it's going to keep our rhythms in a nice cycle. Okay. All right. And so you can't see my credits here, but we've got Zamora and I think Walker to 2017. And so now we do have somebody in the chat, but I didn't catch what they're saying. We have 8 more tips, okay, for improved health and happiness. And so a brief section here, but a side note first. Let's see what I can do for that. And so a little bit about cortisol. Cortisol is, whoops, there it is, a stress hormone. And you might think automatically that sounds bad. But you might know a little bit of stress is good. It can help us be alert, pay more attention. It can help us marshal our resources, all kinds of good things like that. But there's a but. And the but is that we have receptors for cortisol basically all over our body. We have receptors for stress hormones in our brain. We have receptors on fat cells. We have receptors in the heart. And so if we are chronically stressed, that is not a good thing. All right, so I'm going to move that here. All right, so chronically high levels of stress hormones could lead to increased blood sugar, increased blood pressure, and increased inflammation. Chronically high levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, can also damage the hippocampus, which is a brain area important for learning and memory. So this could also increase our risk for dementia. So we want to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Isabel. Yes, ma'am. Yes, yeah, and I love that question. Isabel had mentioned that people who maybe are struggling with mental illness, they might have high levels of cortisol, which in turn could affect memory. I was going to mention it at the end, but it's all connected. And so that's one thing that makes this all so interesting. So for the 8 tips I'll mention, a lot of them have to do with reducing our stress hormones, like Isabel said. Before we get to those 8 points, a little bit of fine print. I know we're going to make our research methods professors out there happy. We're going to see interesting articles in the news about new findings and things like that. And we just have to be knowledgeable, cognizant, right, that sometimes the research is preliminary. And so we want to be aware of how many participants are in the study, right? If it's just a few number, maybe the results aren't generalizable, right? They could be thrown off by a small number. We also want to know what are the controls in a study. I was looking at a research study. The participants did a 3-month yoga retreat, which sounds fantastic. But during that 3-month yoga retreat, they also had a healthier diet and they slept better, right? So there's statistics that can be done to try to determine which factor is most important, but we kind of have to look to see what a particular study did. In addition, we want to be aware of assignment of participants to conditions. We don't want all the healthy people in one group, the non-healthy people in the other, because they're already different to start off with. And lastly, replication, right? We want to see, can other labs reproduce similar results, maybe using a different approach. All right, well, so with all of those in mind, we go here for more tips for health and happiness. And so I kind of ordered these from ones that I found maybe least surprising to most surprising. So we start off here with mindset. So basically how a person thinks about things, how they approach things. Honestly, probably no surprises here. Optimists have lower risk of heart attacks and stroke. They also have lower amounts of cortisol. Optimists tend to live longer. And something that's related is also our views on aging. So people who have positive views of aging tend to live longer, as opposed to people who have negative views on aging. So all of this has to do with mindset. So our mindset is going to affect our health. In addition, we also have meditation and mindfulness. So there's a lot of interesting research. Meditation will reduce anxiety, perceived stress. Basically, that's self-reported stress, right? So psychological stress. So that is reduced. Also, stress hormone levels. So physical stress is reduced as well, along with chronic pain. Meditation may improve immune function and also lead to better sleep, better eating habits, and we've got one more here. Meditation may also reduce that inflammation that we had talked about and increase BDNF. So BDNF, this is a protein in our brain. This will increase cell survival and increase learning and memory. So here for number 3, we've got connectedness. And so spirituality can be considered a type of connectedness. So how connected are we to the people around us? And so people who are more connected, they're going to have an increased lifespan, increased pain tolerance, right? All good things. And what the research suggests is that the quality of close relationships is better than having a lot of relationships. Right? We've also got the flip side here, which is not as good news. So loneliness may be a predictor. Actually, this study just came out this week. Loneliness may be a predictor of future unemployment, right? People who score high on loneliness, they actually might have similar health risk as people who are struggling with obesity and smoking, right? So we've got this idea here that connectedness is important. I also have this quote. The US Surgeon General gave a talk recently, and he said, I came to realize that we have more people who struggle with loneliness in our country than have diabetes, right? And so actually, if we can have that connection, we can fix the loneliness and fix diabetes, right? All right, so here, this is hopefully going to make a lot of people happy. We've got the idea here of travel and planning can increase health and happiness. There's a link between international travel and creativity. More travel, better, right, than infrequent travel. And for vacations, they're associated with a reduced risk of heart disease. And vacations are also associated with a reduction in anxiety and cortisol. Right? So another tip for health and happiness. We've got here number 5. We've got 4 left. This one is basically spending time in nature. In Japan, they call it forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku. The idea is spending time in a natural setting is going to provide health and mental wellness benefits. I think this is kind of exciting. It could be a little bit as 20 minutes a day or 120 minutes a week. And they studied it different ways. One way in which they studied, they had people walk on a treadmill in a lab versus people take a walk in a park. And so both groups of people are exercising, but there's an added bonus for being in nature. They also had people take a walk in a city versus take a walk in the park. Same idea. There's something about being in nature that provides an extra boost. People would have a decreased risk of diabetes, decreased risk of heart disease, obesity, cancer, and depression. The flip side, improved mental health, improved focus, improved blood pressure, immune system function, and lower cortisol. Two more things to mention. I think this is good news as well. We don't actually have to be it's good. We don't have to actually be physically active when we're in this natural setting. We could be sitting somewhere in nature for 20 minutes and still derive these benefits. And there's some intriguing research, and hopefully we can do more than have a window, but at least having a window can help. So there's research of people recovering in a hospital. Both groups of participants have a window in their room, but one group of participants has a window onto a nature scene, the trees, a park, or something like that. The other group, who's also in the hospital recovering, their window looks onto another building, right? And so the people who got the window where it's looking onto a nature scene, they're going to recover faster, right? So a lot of, I think, very interesting, intriguing things here. So we've got 3 more left. This one might be a surprise, but I thought it was actually pretty neat. So I went ahead and included it. So singing, and this could be alone or with other people, is going to reduce cortisol. So if we are with other people, we've got an increased sense of belonging and connection. Some of the physical effects: singing may stimulate the body's immune system, release endorphins, as in like runner's high. Also, singing could increase lung function, decrease snoring. And also intriguing that singing can improve memory in those who are struggling with dementia, right? So yay for singing. Here, second to last one, we've got kindness. And so again, interesting research in this particular area. So if somebody engages in acts of kindness, that'll reduce their cortisol, right? So reduce their stress hormones, reduce blood pressure, improve heart health, and boost happiness. Kindness can also help that person, give them a sense of purpose and a sense of connectivity. When we engage in kindness, this actually can activate the reward centers in our brain. So I know you've caught this, but I just want to go ahead and say it. So we're helping other people by being kind, but we're also getting our own boost here at the same time. And volunteering, which is a kind of kindness, research has shown that volunteering can reduce stress, reduce symptoms of depression, reduce risk of cognitive impairment. And so now on to our very last one, our last tip for health and happiness. And so this one is gratitude. And so there's a decent amount of research. Some of these areas are kind of new, that writing in a gratitude journal, sometimes for as short as 2 weeks, can actually provide a boost. And so writing in this gratitude journal could reduce perceived stress, which is that self-reported psychological stress, could reduce cortisol, as well as blood pressure and inflammatory markers. Writing in this gratitude journal, I thought this was intriguing, can also reduce consumption of dietary fat, which in turn could help lower risk of diabetes. We've got a last one here. Using this gratitude journal can also improve cognition, right? And so here we have these 8 tips for health and happiness. Again, as I mentioned, some of this is in a fairly new fields of research, so the research continues, but here's some recent journal articles. One of these is Kindness Matters. It happens to be in people with diabetes, but kindness is important, even if you don't have diabetes, right? And so a randomized control group shows improvements in depression, distress, and immune system function. So that's kindness. You can't see it very well here. This one here is about vacation and creativity. So yes to vacation. That's always a good idea. Here, singing modulates mood, stress, cortisol, cytokine, so immune system function in cancer patients, but also their caregivers who are also under a lot of stress. A couple more here: decreased cortisol amongst hikers who value being in a nature setting. And lastly, mindfulness and its effects on cortisol in sleep, right? So there's things that we can do to make a difference. And so one question here is where to start. You're probably not going to be surprised. So the 3 pillars for sure, especially sleep. And so this is my last lecture, right? As if I was the last one I was going to give. On my second to last lecture, I would talk about habits and how to form them and things like that. But for today, I'll just mention that research shows that it's going to take a little bit of time to make a new habit. But if we can engage in it for a month and a half, 2 months, it's going to become better ingrained. And then if possible, we can add a new habit. But it's okay to mess up because it's going to happen, right? We're going to fall off the wagon, but we just plan for contingencies and start again. And then if possible, to make it social, because we saw that that provides a boost. It could be for exercise, it could be for singing, it could be kindness, but there's definitely a theme here. And so we mentioned this with Isabel earlier, but it's all connected. So if we can start, basically on this path, if we can improve in one area, it's going to make it easier to improve in others. So I want to say thank you again to Mortar Board. I really appreciate being invited to talk. And so I also want to say thank you to current and former students and colleagues. I've appreciated working with you guys, and that has been a privilege. And then lastly, to thank friends and family for your help and for your support. So thank you. So I think we have time for questions. Yep. Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. And sorry, did you say different like locations of studying that could be helpful? Or I missed the first part. Okay, yeah. And so that gets a little bit to the spacing that we talked about earlier. So if we can study in at different times of day, that definitely could be helpful. And so the idea is as we create memories, we can associate them with different contexts. And so when it's that testing time, maybe the testing situation will match one of the contexts that we use when we were studying. So I teach a human memory class. So if we space things out, maybe one time you study when you're happy, maybe one time when you're sad, one time when you're hungry, one time when you're sleepy, but hopefully one of those will match the testing situation, and that should provide a little bit of a memory boost. So definitely spacing always better than cramming. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's very interesting. So a question about sleepwalking. So it tends to occur in our deepest stages of sleep. So non-REM, stage 3, 4. And I think the conventional wisdom is to try to guide the person back to bed because they're in a very deep stage of sleep, and it's kind of a shock to the system to wake them up. But you also had mentioned basically sleep eating, right? And that can also be associated with stage 3, 4. I think for some people, they'll eat like random things like tubs of butter and things like that, right? And so they're no butter yet, right? That's good. But then there could be just some health, I'll say disadvantages, right? Because it's not healthy, maybe some of the choices that we make when we're eating. And so some of the things are maybe more straightforward, like lock the doors. Because in my sleep class, I think we've seen the video this year. There's a video where there's a little girl, she's sleeping out on the driveway. I don't know how she got there, but I'm like, oh, I hope that they lock their doors. And then the conventional wisdom is that if it doesn't have a huge impact on their day, then maybe they don't need to seek help. But on the other hand, if it does have impact and it's messing them up the next day, then they might need to see a sleep doctor or something like that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry, we'll catch Rachel. Yes. Oh, question. Oh, and I would say hi to Vanessa, as an old research assistant. And you know what? I don't happen to know the drug that well. I don't know. So I don't know if maybe it's increasing stage 3, 4, or it's messing up the cycle somehow, but I would have to look into that. I don't know. I'll say hi to Vanessa again. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, good. And I think we had somebody here. Yes. You know what? I think the research tends to say no, right? Which is really interesting, because I didn't mention this in the talk, but some research suggests that if people are sleep deprived, they will tend to perceive a neutral stimulus in a negative way, right? And so it's neutral, but I'm sleep deprived, so everything is going to appear negative, right? So it actually seems to be the opposite. So when we do get sleep, we're better able to handle insults, big and small, right? And maybe let things bounce off of us a little bit easier, right? Okay, good. Oh, Ahmet, yes, sir. What do we got? I know, right? And one reason I still say that is because there's sleep researchers will argue, right, on why we sleep. So thank you for your question, right? And Ahmet was saying, I said sleep was a mystery, but we got a lot of information up there. But one sleep researcher says the only thing we're sure about, and I know you've heard this before, is that we know that we sleep so we can get rid of sleepiness, right? And that's the only thing we're sure about. But I actually did see another quote on that, so I'm going to go ahead and use this chance to mention it. Is that so this book Walker, we have this idea that wakefulness is low-level brain damage while sleep is neurological sanitation, right? And so it's very interesting, this idea that, and he's kind of joking when he talks about it, but maybe what we're really supposed to be doing is sleeping, but every once in a while we need to wake up and eat and stuff like that, right? So maybe, right? Yes, Monique, and then Steve and Emily. Sometimes they can, so the question is, do negative or bad dreams affect the sleeper? And sometimes they can wake us up. So maybe the sleep fragmentation isn't good. And sometimes they can be kind of stressful. I woke up one morning, I dreamed that a big tree branch is falling on my head. So it's like, oh my gosh, I almost died. So that's not good. But we do tend to incorporate things that happen to us during the day in our sleep. And so oftentimes it is things that bother us, right? And I've noticed that on days that are more stressful, I don't sleep as well, right? On days where I sleep better. And so, and then Steve, and then Emily, yes, yeah. Yes. So it's a good question. And so the question is this increase in adenosine associated with sleep rebound? So the idea is if we've either been awake for a long period of time or, well, basically sleep deprived, we're going to have rebound the next time that we sleep. So I think that they are associated, and we tend to get more non-REM sleep first when we do that sleep rebound. Yeah. And then Emily, yes. Yes. Oh, I mean, I would for sure. So the questions about like school and sleep, school start times and things like that. Oh, and so now sorry, Rachel, I see 8 in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to catch you in a second. And so it may sound kind of hokey, but I would actually, if we have the opportunity to choose, I would try to find a school that has a later start time. And so there is a fair amount of research that schools that have an earlier start time, kids are tired and they're not paying attention. And so they're like in high schools, they're going to get lower SAT scores and things like that. There's at least one school, I think in the Midwest, where they delay their school start time by an hour, higher SAT scores. Other schools, less car accidents, around the school, because we don't have a whole bunch of sleep deprived people driving to school. And so, there are particular schools that are moving in that direction, and it's probably past due, right? Because if they're tired, they're not going to learn anything anyway. So I'm going to turn to Rachel real fast. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay. All right. I want to say thank you to Jonas. And that's interesting because we're going to talk about that on Wednesday, Jonas. So shout out to my sleep class. So we'll talk about advanced sleep phase. This is like grandma or grandpa falling asleep at 7, at night, or delayed sleep phase, going to bed a couple hours later. And so, yes, so there are different circadian rhythm disorders that are going to be affected. I forgot to make a shout out to Dr. DeBell's class. Thank you for coming. And then also one, so I've got a cousin in New York. I don't know if she's still on, Veronica Mitnock. Her high school English students are tuning in from New York City. So, hey, Dalton School. Yeah, I know. Very nice. And so let me check. Was there other people I had missed? Oh, that's good. Yeah. And sorry, I'm going to catch you in the back. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question. And Walker talks about it a little bit in his book. He calls them prophylactic naps. So, for example, like airline pilots, they know they're going to be awake for a long time. So there's research. Well, when is the best time? Because we don't want them to make mistakes, right? So when's the best time to take a nap? Is it before their stretch of sleep deprivation, in the middle of it, or at the end? And as it turns out, if they can take a nap before a long stretch of sleep deprivation, they're going to be a little bit more alert and make less errors. Yeah. Okay, good. Sorry, there's somebody in the back. I had been missing you. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I think so. The question is, if we do miss some sleep, is it better to nap the next day or to stay awake? So it's also a good question. I want to say thank you as well. And so the thinking is maybe not to take a nap, right? Because we want to try to maintain a consistent sleep cycle as much as possible. And so go back to shift workers, right? They can slowly shift to a new time, but they're going to slowly shift over time. And so your body might not know, oh, are we shifting to night work or something like that? And so there's a potential. I mean, every once in a while it's going to be fine, but there's a potential that it will throw us off our consistent pattern. Yeah. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. So a good question about, are there like food supplements that we can take? So I don't know so much about the food supplements, but there are certain foods that might be better to eat, before we go to bed. And so milk, maybe not a surprise, could be one of them, but even foods like dark cherries, right? So they can kind of help set us up to have a good night of sleep. And then to avoid the heavy fatty, and I love cheese, but no cheese, no heavy proteins, things like that. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Rachel. Yes. Oh, and so a shout out also to Damaris, from my fall 2003, my very first class here at USD. So it's a good question, Damaris. I need to catch up with you because apparently there's kids involved. And so that is so tough, right? Because it's going to take a couple months before that child establishes a regular sleep pattern. And it's so hard. I tease my students in the sleep class. I say, be nice to your parents and in-laws because you're going to need help the first 2 or 3 months before the baby establishes a pattern. So we talked about circadian rhythms, and the sun is sending us a signal to be awake or asleep. It takes a couple of months for babies to establish that pattern, right? So we got to kind of hang in there. So I think naps could be helpful because you just don't know when you're going to be awake at night. That's a tough one. Yeah. And thank you to Damaris again. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So for most people, it would be 7 to 8 hours. It's going to be very different if we're very, very young. But other than that, it's about 7 to 8 hours. And so there seem to be a subset of people that do require less sleep. They're able to get by on like 3 or 4 or 5 hours. Unfortunately, I don't know what the differences are in those people that they can get away and not have like cognitive impairment and things like that from such little sleep. So I'll have to find out about that. Oh, yes, ma'am, Perla. You know what? That's a good question, Perla. And so how accurate are the Fitbits? I think there is, I'm not very familiar with it. I think there's some initial research showing that some might be more accurate than others. And so it might depend on the actual Fitbit. And I'm sorry, because I don't know a whole lot about that. I know we've got those neat rings that we can wear and people can use their phones. So Fitbit would probably be more accurate than a phone because we're wearing it. But I don't know a whole lot about like which ones might be better. Yeah. So let's see, maybe we take one more if there's one more, and then we'll head to the foyer or whatever it's called. Head up there. Go for it. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. And so thank you to Aliana. So that's a good question as well. And so we can sleep too much. So there is an optimum amount of sleep. And so sometimes people who are struggling with depression, that might be a characteristic that they sleep too much or sleep too little, right? And so it might throw off our rhythms if we're sleeping too much, right? The sun is rising, but we're missing that because we're asleep. So yeah. All right. I want to say thank you so much again. Thank you for coming out. Very much appreciated.